Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to our very first Meet the Editor interview. You know me already, I'm Medina. We are delighted to be talking to Suad Kamardeen today. She is an editor at Amaliah, but she also is loads of other things. I'm going to read a very quick bio about her so you get to know all of the feathers in her cap. Suad Kamardeen is a British Nigerian Muslim writer, editor, and photographer. She is a founding editor of WAYF Journal, WAIF. I don't know how she would like to pronounce that. She can tell us in a minute. Her young adult novel Never Enough, won the SI Leeds Literary Prize 2022, and her adult novel was shortlisted for the Stylist Prize for Feminist Fiction 2021. Suad runs Qalb Writers Collective, a community to support Black and Muslim women writers with knowledge and resources, something we love to do. She also co-hosts Ore Meji, you can tell me if I'm probably pronouncing this wrong, Ore Meji Yoruba Nisoki, a podcast centered on embracing her mother tongue, Yoruba. Suad is committed to documenting histories and cultures, as well as impacting people's lives positively through storytelling. So this is all stuff that we're super excited about, and it's wonderful to chat with you today, Suad. Assalamu alaikum, how are you?
Walaikum salam. I'm very well, thank you. I am so excited to be here. It's always weird listening to someone else read your bio because I'm like, oh, I do these things. But yeah, you're right. It was WAIF Journal, which basically means where are you from? And it was Meji as well. It was all right. It's just a podcast with a friend where we try to have random conversations or just general conversations in Yoruba, because I'm very passionate about languages and preserving languages. And I didn't grow up with my parents speaking Yoruba to me. Now they do, but growing up they didn't. And so we're trying to preserve that so that we can have something to pass on as well.
Alhamdulillah, that's wonderful. So first of all, thank you so much for agreeing to talk to us about your role at Amaliah. I think it's incredibly important for writers at any stage of their journey, but especially people who are setting out and just beginning to think about how they would like their work to be published or shared, you know, with a broader audience. Could you tell us a little bit, first of all, about your work at Amaliah? What is Amaliah and how did you get involved with them?
So Amaliah is an amazing platform for Muslim women, and our ethos is it was initially on amplifying the voices of Muslim women, but now we are trying to share more stories that help Muslim women thrive because we have more and more voices out in the wild. And I've always known of Amaliah for a very long time, and I wrote for them in the past in 2018 and 2019, but it was only in 2021 that I joined as an editor. And it's been a fun experience since then. So we started off publishing a lot of pieces a month, and we've transitioned now to slower publication, just because we wanted to be more intentional about the pieces that were going out and the quality of the pieces. But we also wanted to have more time to spend with the writers so that we can nurture them. And because I find that when you're publishing a lot and quickly, there's no time to actually sit with a writer and nurture their strengths and like spend time with them on the piece. Whereas when it's slow and you know that you don't have to hurry up to publish something by next week, you can really take your time with the piece. I mean, there are some pieces that require quick turnaround when it's like very time limited, or for example, there's an event that's come up and we have to do something like that. But in general, we try to encourage slower publishing just because it means that you can nurture a writer and get them to do more. But it's all about starting conversations that we need to have in the Muslim community. It could be something that people are talking about in their dinner table conversations, and then we overhear it and we want to platform those conversations. And we also wanted to move away from just negative stories about Muslims or Muslim women. We also wanted Muslim women to be the ones who tell their own stories and be the champion of their own conversations, which I find that it's not usually the case in a lot of situations. Even till now, you still find like articles or stories written about Muslim women, but not usually by Muslim women. And so Amaliah is just out there to change that, to empower Muslim women to tell their stories. I feel like, I mean, just thinking about how much I'm committed to storytelling, it's the person who has the mic that has the control, the person who tells a story that can shape literally how you're presented to the world. And I think about like what's going to happen in the world within the next 40, 50 years, or even 100 years and beyond, like what stories are going to be out in the world for people to see. And so I think it's important for Muslim women to be at the forefront of their own storytelling. And that's what Amaliah is trying to do, basically. Yeah.
Mashallah, so exciting to listen to this and like to actually see it happening and in practice. It's like this is something that, you know, me growing up in the 90s in England, it was like where I was actually quite demoralized about wanting to be a writer and thinking what kind of platforms could I even write for, like who's going to want my voice and who's going to accept me talking the way that I want to talk and talking about the things that mean something to me. And I know that they mean something to other people as well, but it's about finding those interstices, right? And like finding those spaces where you can meet kindred souls and have those heart to heart, which is, alhamdulillah, I'm really happy that Amaliah exists. Long may it thrive. I have a little question that came up in our membership community. Actually, one of our male members was asking about, you know, what kind of platforms he could write about, something a little bit more lighthearted or sort of, I guess, not in a sort of highly journalistic sort of dry sense, more about life. And somebody recommended Amaliah, and then we were like, oh, they only publish for women. And so it was sort of just like a question that popped into my head, you know, is it like a hard and fast rule to only publish Muslim women? Or if a man came along and wanted to talk about something that had to do with, you know, relationships with women or gender that seemed to fit the general vibe, is that something that would be countenanced, do you think?
I feel like I think it would probably be a matter of interviewing the person. If it's a topic that we feel like it's so important and we can't find any woman in the world to have that conversation, then we would platform the man. I just think there aren't many spaces for women, let alone Muslim women, and it's so important to keep this space sacred, in my opinion. And that's kind of how I feel about publishing women, because like sometimes some of the conversations that we get to have on Amaliah, I feel like people come in to message us or privately saying, like, I've never seen this put up before, this really resonated with me and this made me feel so vulnerable. And to thinking about how this space is a safe space and it holds a lot of vulnerability for a lot of women. I just feel like I don't think that there can be a man who can write something about a woman's topic better than a woman could write about it. I just don't think so.
I agree, actually, in terms of like women's topics, but I would love to see a parallel, I suppose, a place where men could get vulnerable and write about something that is.
I think that's important. I actually think that is super important. And I've been talking to one of my cousins, she's a psychologist, and she's a Muslim, right? And we've been talking a lot about how even though we're having these spaces more and more for women to have vulnerable conversations, we still have to interact with men in the world. Like women are still married to men and still have brothers and fathers. So men need to also be met somewhere with room to have these conversations. And I mean, Amaliah doesn't have to be the place, but I wonder what that place could be for men to have those conversations. Because I agree with you, it is very important for men to have those conversations. I mean, a lot of men I find in my community around me, they don't know what it means to be vulnerable or to have a safe space where they can just be themselves. It's very like, I'm a man and I do these things, but like there's a lot of emotions that's not spoken about. And I wonder what it would be like if you had a world where men as well as women could literally just be themselves and be vulnerable and be open.
Yeah, it would. I feel like it would pretty much transform quite a lot, actually. So can you talk us through your day? What does the life of a magazine editor look like on a day-to-day basis?
So, I mean, I normally block out my time in terms of the week on Monday. So we get a lot of pitches, right, from writers who want to write for Amaliah. So on Monday, there's usually a meeting with the editorial team, going through the pitches that we received and just talking through the ones that we want to accept or maybe review or tell the writer to reconsider. So Mondays are usually for reviewing pitches. And then if there's any that's accepted, we send out acceptances on Monday as well. And the way that works is normally you'd say, we've accepted your pitch, and this is how much you pay. Would you consider writing for us? And we normally give a 1 to 2 week deadline for a first draft turnaround. And that's bearing in mind that sometimes there will be more work required for second and third drafts, just to shape the piece to becoming the best version it can be. Sometimes someone can pitch something to us and we can recognize that, oh, we have something quite similar, but this person could elevate the conversation in this way. So then in that email, I would be saying, we have something similar, but we feel like we can bring in this other part of the conversation to this article. Do you agree? Do you not agree? So that's what usually Mondays are for, reviewing pitches and catching up or chasing up on pieces that we're waiting to hear back from the writers from. And then I normally block out at least 2 days for editing, because editing takes time and it's like, it requires a lot of brain work. So I would kind of schedule a time to do, if it's a new piece, I would have a couple of new pieces and I'd do like a first round of reading just to kind of get a feel of the piece and the writing. And then I'd do a second round reading, which is then the editing process, basically. So editing normally takes place in a couple of steps. We'd have like the structure edits. Does the piece actually say what the pitch said it was going to say, and does it do what it's trying to achieve, and is there a clear path from start to finish? I mean, I'm sure you know all of this because you've written a book, and you write a lot as well in general, but you know how sometimes you can have a dream, right, or a vision for a piece, and when you write the first draft, that's not really what's on the page. And so it's about going back to the writer and saying, well, this is done, this, but we need you to shape it into this. So I spend like a day doing a lot of the structure edits. And then when it comes to like the line by line edits and the copy editing, I would do that on a different day as well. And then in the middle of all of these, I would usually have a meeting with the social team, because even the editorial is the bedrock at Amaliah. This has to be shared on our social so that other people who don't necessarily come to the website, who don't necessarily engage with Amaliah.com, but engage with the socials, can have access to the content and see what's out on Amaliah, see how they can contribute their voice. So, you know, on the website, there isn't a feature for commenting, but it's because we like to have those conversations on social media so that people can interact with one another and actually bring the voice of the community into the conversation. So on one of those days, I would have a meeting with the content team to say, this is how we want to present this piece. So some pieces, for example, would require a particular way of being presented on social media beyond just quotes. So very recently, we had a writer who interviewed like 4 other writers, 4 other entrepreneurs, women who were talking about lost generation items. So things that like have been passed down to them from their parents, but they're not sure is being passed on, and how they're working hard to preserve those things. And it was so wholesome. And I thought we have to do beyond just sharing like quotes for this. So just having a conversation with the social team about what would be the best way to platform each of the stories that these women have told us, because they come from such diverse cultures, and do justice to like sharing this piece. So those are the kind of conversations that we would also have at Amaliah. And then on Friday, I would normally do admin as well, just checking again the progress of the pieces, how far we've come. Is there a writer who we're waiting to hear back from? Is there a writer who has sent us something but hasn't been able to send it? I think sometimes you can have a vision for a very, very good pitch, but then you might be struggling to write the piece, or you might be stressed about writing the piece because you've kind of created this big thing and you're not sure how to tackle it. So sometimes writers would come back and say that, hey, they've been working on this, but they're not sure how to go about it. And in the email, I guess via email conversation, you kind of break down what are you trying to say. And for me, I was kind of trying to tell them to go back to the thesis. What's the thing that you want the person to take away from this? And that's also why our pitch is like structured in the way that it is on the form. Like when you submit a pitch to us, you have to say who you think is going to benefit from it, what the main takeaway is, because I think it's very easy to get lost when you have a big idea and not exactly know what you're actually trying to communicate to an audience. So Fridays are usually for check-ins and for things like this, basically. So it usually varies. I mean, sometimes it might have more of these things on one day than the other. So Mondays might have editing, for example, maybe because there's a piece that's come in and it's really timely and we want to edit it very quickly. Or yeah, but generally it's just literally pitch reviews, editing, getting back to writers, being in touch with writers, asking some writers to write for us, just variation of that basically. And I guess generally there's also analytics, because I was working as the head of editorial. So I would kind of, every time we publish a piece, right, it goes up on the website and there's Google Analytics for it. And that basically tells us like how many people are reading it on a daily basis, how many people are reading on a weekly basis. And that helps us to see what people want to see more of, or what people are reading more of. And the newsletter also informs sometimes the conversations that we have on editorial, because some people who sign up to our newsletter don't necessarily come on the website to read, right? So sometimes they might be more interested in a particular piece or a particular question, and that kind of informs some of what we're looking for. Sometimes it might be the agony aunt that informs a decision. So we get a lot of questions for our agony aunt column, and that kind of, if you see a similar question over time, we might be like, okay, maybe we should write a piece addressing this. And Yeah, so for example, we had a piece called we had a piece on step by step ghusl, and I remember that came from a newsletter. We had a couple of people actually asking that in the agony aunt column, saying like, how can I do ghusl? I'm just newly married and it's a lot of work, like having to do this as a woman, and there's a specific nuance of being a Black woman. How do I do this with my hair? And so we answered that in the newsletter, and we saw that that newsletter got a lot of opens, and then that turned into a post. So we got more resources and like more information into that post, and it literally does so well. I guess because it's a necessity for people to know how to do ghusl, especially when you get married or just with your period as well. So yeah, like this, that's generally the day to day at Amaliah.
Wow, mashallah, that's so informative. Thank you so much. Like, I'm gonna have to borrow some
No
of that
worries.
workflow because like having a day for each thing, I mean, it really helps you to focus. And my problem is I have a lot of things going on at the same time, so I tend to be quite scattered, and to like streamline it in that way is, I think, really helpful. I wanted to ask, do you commission pieces as well? Like, this is a really interesting thing of looking at the feedback and seeing analytics and seeing what people are interested in, and a conversation that a topic that comes up regularly. Would you go, oh, I think actually there's going to be enough interest to commission something, and let's think about which writer we want to commission for that?
Yeah, actually. So for example, the piece on the lost generation items was actually commissioned. So I knew someone who would be a good fit for writing that, and I knew that she needed the right people to have these conversations with. In, I think last 2 years ago, we had a piece around PMDD, and that was also commissioned. We had somebody who was working in the women's health sector, and she interviewed other women who were struggling with PMDD, and she wrote a piece for us. So when we have those analytics, so when we also observe our social media a lot, and there's a lot of conversations that happen on Twitter. So when we see a particular conversation happening on Twitter, we could reach out to the writer and say, hey, we saw this conversation and we think you'd be a very good fit for writing this. So we tend to do that as well. But most of our pieces actually come from the pitch, because people are also very like aware of the conversations going on, and so they send in pitches to say, this is happening, I'd like to write about this, basically.
That's so interesting. Oh my gosh. Just out of curiosity, how big is your team roughly?
It's actually not that big. There's about 8 of us.
Mashallah. It's nice though to have other people to kind of workshop ideas with, or bounce ideas around from, and then it's not all people. Hold on, there was another thing I was going to ask. It's gone. Okay, so could you tell us some of your pitch loves and hates? What are the kind of things that you love to see pitched, and what kind of things you just go, ugh?
Oh, that's hard. I would say pitch love. I love when, like in some pitches, it's very clear that the writer has thought about what they're actually trying to communicate. And they've also thought about like who, sometimes people pitch to us, and I wonder if like they know who the audience is. And sometimes people pitch to us and it's very clear that they've kind of been on the website, they've engaged with Amaliah. So they'd be like, I know that you have a piece on this and this, but this will elevate the conversation in this way, or this is a particular conversation I've seen across your socials. So things I love about, like I think good pitches are the ones that touch on conversations that are being had at the moment. And even if it's not touching on the conversation that's being had at the moment, it's bringing something fresh, something new, something insightful. We had an article last year around vaginismus. And I'd vaguely heard about it, but I didn't even have that much detail about it. And this person who wrote the piece for us, she was like, I'm not a very strong writer, but I'm very passionate about this because I'm a midwife and I've worked with a lot of women who struggle with this. And I thought, such an important topic, I'm happy to support you on this. And it was very clear in the pitch what she wanted to achieve with this. It was important to her to raise awareness and let people know what to do and where to go, and to share stories of those who have actually been through it, but then also overcome it. And it was very useful to see how she's kind of thought about how she was going to approach and what research she was going to use. So those are like really good strengths in the piece. It's always like, how are you adding to a conversation that's going on? How are you showing us something new that we've never heard about? And like, how are you thinking about how you're going to structure your arguments? Because sometimes we get a pitch and it's quite nice pitch, but the pitch is actually the article. Like, asking if a pitch would just be a post on Instagram, which might sound really mean, but sometimes that's literally all there is to say about the topic. It'd be like a paragraph, and then it doesn't have to be an article. I would say a good pitch is one that's also really well structured, just because it's when something is well structured, it's usually well thought out. So we have a couple of questions that we recommend people answering on the form, and sometimes people don't answer the questions. And I feel like if you answer the question, it would actually help you realize if your pitch needs a little bit more work, and maybe what you could do to add to it, what you could do to change it. I mean, pitching is quite hard, to be honest. It's hard to tell someone, I want to talk about this thing and I'm going to do justice to this thing, because it doesn't give a sense of your writing. But I would say that the thing that makes for a strong pitch would be just a lot of clarity. Like, it should be clear from your pitch that you know what you're talking about, and that you know the right sources to have a conversation with. And sometimes I guess this is a pitch dislike. Well, sometimes people pitch and it's clear that they've only just stumbled upon the topic and they're not aware how far the conversation in the real world has gone on that topic. And I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I remember there was a pitch about something, and you could tell that the person has only just discovered like this thing, but there'd been so many conversations, and that conversation in particular is carried on. So like, it has to be clear that you do your own research and you do your own due diligence, and you're aware that some of these conversations they've gone far, and are you then the best person to carry the conversation? Or is this just you trying to do your personal learning? Another thing I've noticed that I like is people love sharing personal experiences, which I think is really good because we can all benefit from one another's personal experience. But one thing that we don't generally publish personal experience piece unless there's an added layer of something. So, for example, if I'm going to talk about something I've gone through, I want to add more to that conversation beyond like what I went through. So it might be me bringing in the voices of other Muslim women in my community. It might mean just bringing in more research. It might mean having a conversation with experts around that topic. Whereas sometimes it's a matter that someone has gone through something and they probably are only just processing it, or they haven't finished processing it, but they feel like people need to know about this, and so they kind of send a pitch. Which sometimes is quite difficult because it's quite raw and you don't want to let them down in that way. It's always hard to say no to a pitch when it's very personal. But it's also a conversation around, am I ready to share this thing that I've just experienced? Have I actually worked through it? What's the thing about this experience and the working through of this experience that I feel like makes it so important to want to share? And then how do other Muslim women connect on a level? So there was a piece that we published, I think at the start of the year or the middle of the year, and it was around freezing your eggs as a Muslim woman. And I remember that started as a pitch of the author just wanted to write about her struggles finding a partner and being in her 30s but really wanting kids. And I remember saying to her, like, this is nice and it's a relevant conversation, but it has to do more than just talk about your personal experience. And at first she was like, oh, I'm not so sure if I can find other people who are interested in talking, who would want to talk to me about this. And I was like, you never know, like you never know until you try, but you would need more to elevate this piece because we already have enough conversations around being single and being Muslim and wanting to get married. And she literally went onto this Reddit group that she was a part of, and she just asked Muslim women if they would like to speak about the experiences being single. And that literally elevated the piece, because what happened was she got so many different people's perspective, which actually was eye-opening for her, but also was really good for the piece because it allowed us to see a range. There was somebody who was already freezing her eggs. There was somebody who was like, actually, I'm in my 30s and I'm single. I do want to get married, but I don't really think too much about this in terms of, like, I'm not really concerned about freezing my eggs. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen. And that was surprising for her because she was like, oh, a lot of women in their 30s or Muslims and single want to get married would be concerned about fertility. But one of the people who she interviewed was like, actually, I don't think too much about fertility. So it was nice to kind of get the range of what people were doing and what people were thinking when it came to just being a single Muslim woman, which was, I think, a more reflective, a piece that was more reflective or more representative of like the Muslim women community than like having just one person say, this is how it is. So I think sometimes you can get a very strong pitch about a particular topic and there's just some things that can elevate the piece. So just doing some work with yourself in terms of, okay, I pitched this. Is this something I would want to read if someone published it on their website? Like, would I be interested in reading this as a piece? Or would I want more? Like, if I went on someone's page and they told me about being single, like, what is the thing that elevates that experience for me? Because some people write really reflective piece. So we had an author who was talking about how she went from not liking marriage to not wanting to get married because of her parents' horrible marriage experience. Her dad actually assaulted and killed her mum, and she talked about how and how she didn't want to get married and all of that, but now she's happily married. And so she was talking about how she was glad that she changed her mind. But you could tell in the writing of the piece that she had worked through the trauma, she had worked through like everything that's happened, but B, you could see that it wasn't about, the story wasn't a trauma story at all. That came up in the piece, like she mentioned it or she talked about it, but it wasn't the story about this is what happened to my mom and my dad. My dad did this to my mom and that's why I don't want to get married. It was a very nuanced conversation. She talked about how she wasn't part of a Muslim community for some time after everything happened, but then also how some of her friends influenced her decision. Like all of the extra added layer of detail was the thing that elevated the piece beyond it being about the fact that her dad did something to her mom, which stopped her from wanting to get married. So I think good pictures are literally pieces that kind of think about how people are going to engage with the piece. Of course, you write for yourself first and foremost, but then if you're thinking about writing for people to connect to, then think about what is the thing that people would connect with in this piece? What's the thing that I'm trying to say that will resonate with other people in this piece? I would say that's kind of generally my pitch. Give likes and dislikes.
Mashallah. Oh my gosh, you've just laid out so brilliantly the whole process of actually coming up with an idea for a piece, like from pitch. And this is what I find really interesting about the writer-editor relationship, because I do both. I do edit other people's work as well. And it's very hard to edit your own work because you do need that extra perspective. Because when you're in your own experience, you can get very locked into like, this is what's happened to me and these are my feelings. And that's really important to put it onto the page, like pour it out. That's really good. But then once it can be a bit of a limiting perspective because like you say, you need to kind of amplify that perspective and widen it. And it's actually quite a simple thing to do, just to go on, Facebook groups that have to do with a specific topic. Like you said about this lady who went onto her Reddit group and like asking Muslim people about being single. And, it just takes you out of the specificity of your experience. And it gives you these like sort of almost like a 360, like a really good article will give you that the personal, and then also this like zoom out and give you like a broader kind of panorama. And then it all sort of it just brings so much more richness to it. And it's actually not as hard as it sounds, although like to face an editor can be really frightening, right? Like, I mean, you're a very lovely person, I could tell, but like editors can be like, it can be very hard to accept criticism or rejection, but then like to kind of just bite the bullet and go, right, I'm just gonna listen and see what they have to say. Very often like you can kind of go, oh wow, I just didn't see that, and actually that is exactly what my piece needed. Like I just went through this recently with a piece that I first wrote it for my blog about 10 years ago. And I'd always thought I'd like to develop that, but it was too its own experience. It was too much like, this is what happened to me and this is like what my feelings were around it. And then I sort of picked it up again 10 years later. It took that long for me to like separate myself from the experience and sort of digest it and go, well, what was the meaning of that experience? Why was that salient for me? Why was that important and interesting? Why do I keep coming back to it? And then like step away from it a bit and talk about issues that surrounded it, and then sending it to the editor. And she came back with even more like, and I realized I still have neglected this area, and I've neglected that, and my ending was too throwaway. It didn't give enough contemplation, like, and kind of reflection about it, and bring it back to the original premise and like answer the questions that I'd originally posed. So it was such an incredibly valuable experience to go through that feedback and critical feedback, and it is so sort of challenging and frightening at first, but once you sort of get into it, you realize how juicy that is and how brilliant it is.
It is. I love working with editors. I just feel like they elevate you. If you work with a really good editor, you realize how beneficial they are for the piece. Like they really elevate the piece, like, and they bring out the best in it. They help you see like what you might not be seeing in that piece. So yeah.
Exactly, mashallah. And writing in a way is kind of about digestion, isn't it? It's like digesting the experience and then having that kind of zoom in and zoom out. I love that kind of writing that will sort of go from the particular to the political, or just like broaden the panorama and kind of have this like dance almost, like coming in and out. So talking about Muslim representation and in media, I suppose Amaliah is sort of somewhere between literature and media. It's probably more on the kind of media end. But I do consider it literary, because there's some very literary articles that are published there as well. It is literature in the sense it's writing. I feel like Amaliah has really represented a great leap forward in that sense of like specifically Muslim women being able to represent themselves. Do you feel, you're also a writer and a novelist, do you feel that Muslim representation in literature or media more broadly is improving? Is there some still, obviously there's still work to be done. How do you see that work happening?
That's a tough question. Because on one hand, I want to say it's improving, but I'm saying it's improving because I feel like there was nothing before, and now there's a little bit more.
The low bar.
But yeah, the bar is very low, and on the other hand, I feel like so much more could be done. And I just thinking about my personal experience when I was querying for an agent and how I would get rejections because like the person had their Muslim story already or their Black story already, and even having that in publishing as well. And so I feel like there's particular barriers that would still make it difficult for Muslims to publish, because I feel like we're seen as like this monolith, right? And so the Muslim experience is kind of seen as this one experience, and that's why I feel like sometimes publishers have this one quota. They have a quota in their mind for, we can't have more than one Muslim story. But then the Muslim story is so diverse that there's no such thing as the singular Muslim story. I can be a Muslim but have so many different other things that influence the way that I live my life and the way that I present in the world. But I feel like that nuance is missing in the way that the publishing world operates. Whereas unfortunately, if it's a story by a white person, you could have a million variations of that story, and they don't see a problem with that, which is what's shocking to me. And I just think about how like Muslim is not like one particular thing, yet it's seen as this one thing, and that's the one story. And I could be a Muslim who writes stories about Muslim women, but not necessarily be writing about religion, if that makes sense. Like it's just Muslim women experiences about something that they've gone through. And of course the religion comes in, right? Because Islam is a way of life. But then beyond that is the universality of our experiences and the humanness of literally us. We're Muslims, yes, but we're human beings, and we connect on different levels through friendships and love and joy and sadness and pain and sorrow, and all of these things would come in. And being Muslim is a part of that, but it's not necessarily the center of the story. So I do think that a lot of work needs to be done still. I actually am of the belief that we would probably need to create our own spaces or something of the sort if we really want to see the change that we want. Because sometimes I see stories being published written by Muslims and published in like the general publishing landscape, and it sometimes does a disservice to Muslims. And I feel like sometimes it panders to the white gaze, unfortunately. I mean, it is hard to get into the publishing world. So I can understand like why some people would make such decisions, but at the same time, sometimes those stories don't do us a good a service anyway. So I feel like we might need to come to a situation where we are creating our own spaces. And I'm thinking now of this sisters in Canada, the Canadian Somali sisters. And there's four of them, and they came up with it. They started a publishing house, and it was because their sister had written a book and she had queried, and no agent would sign her because they're not sure where to place her story. I had a similar experience as well about this not being sure where to place the story. And out of frustration, they set up their own publishing house and they published her story, but they've published like 6 other books since then. And like starting that and lots of people reaching out to them made them realize how much of a need there is for this. And there's a significant amount of Muslims in the world, but there's not enough stories by Muslims out in the world, and which makes me worried sometimes, because again, I think about what's going to happen in generations to come, what stories are going to be out in the world available for people to read of Muslims, about Muslims. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I do also think it might be a situation where we need to create spaces for ourselves first and foremost, to get our work out in the world.
Yeah, I've got to say, I really agree with the idea of having those spaces. I mean, that was our whole premise with the Muslim Writers Salon, was just, if you're going to be sitting in a writing group, you want to feel comfortable. You want to feel like people around you get you, and you don't have to explain yourself. You don't have to kind of, excuse me. You don't have to kind of give a pamphlet to people and say, this is, you know, these are my religious holidays, and these are my basic beliefs. It's like there's a certain level of commonality, like common understanding, that means that you can just relax a little bit. And I think if you're Muslim living in, particularly as a minority, as a religious minority, you're always a little bit kind of on the edge. You know, you always sort of feel like you have to explain yourself in some way, or like, really, I feel like, I realized recently, I think I grew up just basically perpetually feeling gaslit, because you're surrounded by people kind of think a bit mad, or just like a bit woo, like don't go into that topic because you don't want to hear their views on something or other. And it's such a shame, because it's like, well, if we allowed ourselves to have those spaces to talk about things, we would realize that even among Muslims, we have quite divergent opinions about lots of things. There's still different schools of thought. There's different fatwa on different topics. Like, we can actually have, you know, if we get over that sort of reticence and that fear, but it's sort of part of them. I think it's a part of the minority experience. I mean, I can't say that as a white person, but I think as in a religious sense, like, there is always that sort of fear that like people are gonna sort of judge you or have some kind of assumption about you, and so then you end up with a lot of kind of unspoken barriers, you know, like, you know, just like conversation, it becomes a bit more stilted, and I can't stand that. I just can't stand it. I'm like one of those people that, like, there's an elephant in the room, I'm like, I'm going to talk about the elephant. I'm sorry. I'm going to talk about the elephant. There's a freaking elephant in the room. Like, I think that's why I became a writer, because I just feel like that's one area where you can speak your mind and you can speak your heart. So like, yeah, like having see, my family's been involved in like sort of the Islamic sort of publishing world probably for like at least 20 years, maybe more, maybe like 30 years. My mum used to be a bookseller. She had sold things specifically to do with the Muslim world. My dad's a book designer, so he designs quite a lot of sort of Islamic publishing houses. And so like seeing like sort of the panorama and how that's been evolving is very interesting. Like, it is definitely proliferating. There's different publishing houses and like things for kids and things for maybe a bit more women focused or something like that. I still feel like there's a certain kind of what's the right word I'm looking for? Like, I still feel like people are not completely free to express themselves necessarily. Like, there's certain areas that people are very like, oh, can't go there, can't talk about that. And again, I think this is the minority thing coming up, where you kind of feel like we have to establish ourselves, we have to know who we are, we have to like create something that is defined, but then you have those voices that are just a bit off the wall, or maybe some people want to talk, some people want to write speculative fantasy, like speculative fiction or fantasy, or maybe someone wants to do horror, I don't know. Like, I kind of feel like I want to see those stories. I would love to see a Muslim werewolf story. I don't know, like, maybe that's just me, but like, not necessarily in an Islamic religious thing, but like, they just happen to be Muslim, and it's like normalizing being Muslim. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. And I think of this other world where I write because I love watching Criminal Minds, right, which is a show about this FBI people catching serial killers. And I just imagine a world writing a story of a Muslim detective just doing Muslim woman detective doing detective things. But obviously she's a Muslim, and Islam is her way of life, and that comes in. But there's also just general life conflict that comes up because of that job. Yeah, but it'd be so much fun to see a thriller with a Muslim at the center of the story.
I think we've just put it out there into the world. It's going to manifest. Somebody's going to listen to that and go, I'm going to write that. I'm going to be that writer.
Go for it.
I love
it. It's nice to see, isn't it?
I think it's so beautiful to see all those different kinds of stories. It really is. And like, and just seeing that Muslim is just another thing that people can be, and it's not like something that is necessarily a way of, it shouldn't be something that divides people or sets them into some separate category. It's like you can be a Muslim footballer, or you can, like, we see that there are footballers that can be Muslim, there are basketball players that can be Muslim. So like, let's sort of think outside the box a little bit and imagine, like, dream into it. What else can we be, So alhamdulillah, I'm so, like, I'm a fangirl, like very admiring of, like, the work that Amaliah is doing in that sense, because it is creating that space where you can have that intimacy, you can have that sense of authenticity. I sort of feel like we need to de-pigeonhole ourselves a little bit in that sense. Would you say also it has to do with the risks that Muslims take in terms of what they choose to read as well? Because obviously publishers are going to want to publish something that they know people are going to read. And do you think that there's a relationship there that the choices that Muslims have? I mean, Muslims are picking up books from bookstores. Muslims are picking up books from bookstores about everything. So it's not like they're necessarily going to a sort of a Muslim book. It's such, we can describe something as a Muslim book. But I noticed also that there are kind of more Islamic publishers that will be really specific about what they publish. Like, they'll have like a children's story about Ramadan, and they'll have a children's story about a janazah prayer. And it's great. I think those things are really important to have those stories there. But again, it's like, I sort of feel in a way it's very kind of delineated, and that, like, there could be a little bit more fluidity. I don't know. What do you think?
I think it depends, because I do know of Muslim authors who write children books that are not necessarily about, like, they're not about, like, the deen in terms of, like, Ramadan or Hajj. It's more about friendship or fitting in school and things like that. But I think I recently saw this book. It's a children's book, and it was about this boy who prays in secret. And I think it's nice to have those stories, because even though it's very specifically Muslim, it's a Muslim that pray in secret. It opens up room for conversations that we're trying to have about, like, being a Muslim. If I'm a Muslim, I have things I have to do. For example, I have to pray 5 times a day. And then it's hard to have those conversations for some people till today at work or literally in wherever they exist in. And so having a story with a child already exploring what it means to pray, like, in secret at school, I think it's nice for opening up those conversations. Because even though, like, I don't want us to pigeonhole ourselves in terms of the kind of stories that we tell. I feel like the world still doesn't really understand what it means to be Muslim. Yeah. And there's still some people who are like, what do you mean by you have to do ABC? Or what do you mean by... So, for example, I know that there are people who shake hands, but I personally don't shake hands with the opposite gender. And I remember, like, working at this place years ago, and I didn't shake hands with the men, and they're very okay with it, because I told my manager ahead of time. I was working at the BMW plant, which is basically mostly men. And then my woman colleague, whose hands I shook, she literally kept going on and on about how I wasn't shaking other people's hands. And I was trying to explain to her that that's just my personal preference based on my understanding of the religion. And there are people who shake hands, and, like, you're a woman, I shook your hands, but she just didn't want to, like, let go of that conversation. And so I just think it's quite hard sometimes when you have stories that kind of make this normal, like, oh, someone not shaking hands or someone shaking hands, like, it's normal. That's just how different people choose to interpret the religion for themselves, or someone praying in secret, or someone choosing to pray and find somewhere to pray, or someone, like, all of those different ways in which we can exist as Muslims. I think it's nice to see that just generally in books. So I would want more stories that's, like, I guess, generally mainstream. And so, like, the act of me praying or praying in secret is also normalized in that book. But I think it's nice to have some of those books, because there's still some people who don't understand, like, what it means to be a Muslim, and therefore struggle to have empathy for Muslims when they have whatever struggles that they're facing, or don't really understand why you have to pray 5 times a day, or why you have to find a space to pray, or why you're doing all of those things. Like, I think it's nice to have books who are still having those conversations, because some people just don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need both, really. We need to have those ones that for Muslims to be able to understand what is Islam, because most of the time, we don't all have all of that knowledge, and I think in some ways being a Muslim, you kind of have a double education. You have your sort of normal education, but sort of either Western education or kind of practical education, maths and geography and all that kind of stuff. And then you have this whole other education about Islam, and you know, to sort of juggle all that, it is quite a lot, and usually something it's a lot of plates to be spinning in the air kind of thing. And having those stories can be an incredible way of conveying that information and that knowledge.
And even starting the conversation. Because there's different ways to be Muslim. And so if, for example, you're a Muslim who doesn't believe in a particular thing and someone else believes in it, and maybe all your life you've kind of existed thinking that your way is the only way, and then you come across a book where some Muslim is doing things differently. In the beginning, you might not agree, but then because you've read it and you don't agree, maybe you go and do some research and you find that actually there are people who practice so differently from me that I didn't know about. And that's like one way of your world opening up even more, because now you can see that there's other ways to be Muslim. So I think I like those kind of conversations that come up from books like that.
Yeah, and also books that deal with history. I love books that look into like Islamic history. I'm still waiting to see. When I was growing up, we had these like Usborne little hardbacks, and I got them for my kids as well. You know, you get one about the Romans, and one about the Victorians, and one about birds. And you know, the areas of history, you've got kind of certain areas of like non-Western history which are sort of accepted. You've got the ancient Egyptians, you've got the Aztecs, and then not much else really. I mean, you might get China if you're lucky, but I found that really frustrating. It's something I've actually pitched to Cube Publishing, and they said they were interested, but they weren't going to do it at that time. I even wrote the like what I imagined it could be like for Al-Andalus, like looking at, can you imagine what it'd be like to have that sort of affirmation
as a, be amazing,
not just as a Muslim child to be affirmed, but also to like learn about all these other areas of history. So your family from one area, but you could read about Indonesia, you could read about the Songhai Empire, you could read about Turkey, you could read about, you know, Central Asia, and like expand your idea of what the Muslim world is like. But also my idea was to make it in such a way that you could be a non-Muslim child, like that could go into a library anywhere. So non-Muslim children could learn about that, and then it'd be like, oh mum, why are we always learning about the Aztecs? Like we can also learn about Mali, like we can learn about all these other places. And it would just enrich our awareness, and again, like enrich the understanding of what it is to be a Muslim, because I think ultimately that's kind of what we're trying to get at, like, and to come back to the writer editor process. I love how the way that you describe that sort of coming back to the real nub of what it is that you're talking about, and how like, and I made a note as you're talking about it. I want to prepare a resource on actually writing a pitch, because I think from what you've given us, there's so much information there on like how you can refine an idea, but you always kind of have to come back to the central purpose of it, you know, like this is what this is my intention. It's like coming back to the intention all the time, like, and how I want that impact what impact I want it to have on a reader. It's a very beautiful thing. I don't know if there's anything else you want to say about the writer editor relationship, because you're both as well.
I think I would say just a lot of openness approaching criticism or feedback. Okay, I don't really like the word criticism, even if it's constructive, but I think approaching feedback from a place of openness. You might receive feedback from someone and not agree with it at first, but just reading it and sitting with it for some time, or stepping away from it for a while and allowing it to sit with you and see, even if you don't agree with it, why you don't agree with it, and how it's not feeding your peace, but what can you take from it to allow you to elevate that piece beyond what you've already written in the first place. I would say just approaching writing and editing from a place of openness is a good thing, because sometimes you might start off thinking you're writing about something, but you might be writing about something completely different, and it might take someone else pointing that out to you for you to realize, actually, oh, that is what this is about, and then you can go on to refine the piece even more and make it even stronger. But I would say just openness is what I would say, and being open to like your work being criticized or receiving feedback on something. Like, it's not an attack of your personality or your writing skill. It's just you write something, but you're very close to the writing. Feedback is what elevates your piece and helps it become stronger and better. And so I would say openness is what
I'm also really glad to hear you. Well, I'm glad to hear you say that, because I feel like the editing relationship is like, it's kind of ego work as well. Like, you're really working on your nafs, because there's a part of your nafs that goes, why are they saying that about me? I'm being challenged. And so like, that's a really amazing kind of growth process as well, like a personal growth and personal development. And I love, you mentioned earlier about how sometimes you would take a pitch from someone who is not very experienced as a writer, but they have something really important to say. And is there anything briefly you want to talk about, like how you would help someone who is not very experienced as a writer to develop their idea into a full piece?
I would say if someone sends me a pitch and I can see the strength in it, and then they send me the piece and it's not very strong, I would normally go back to them with a couple of questions as feedback, and I would say, these are some things to think about. This is what stood out to me. This is what's missing. And I think sometimes those questions help people to think further beyond what they're trying to say. Sometimes I feel like people are caught up on like the word count. And so because they're already restricting themselves in the first draft, they don't really say what they're trying to say. But then I'd be like, don't worry about the word count in your first draft, just write. And then you can personally go back and then edit it and tighten it up. But then if you're restricting yourself before you've even gotten the ideas out, then you would never ever do justice to the piece. So if I feel like a topic is very strong and the writer is not very strong in the writing, I would just go back with some guiding questions and get them to think more about. Sometimes people will write and you can tell that they're holding back. Maybe they will tell you this happened, and then they jump onto the next thing that happened, but you have to sit with this thing that you've talked about, or this emotion or this event. You can't just go on to something else, and it's hard work. I say writing and putting yourself on the page is hard emotional work. It's hard like mental work as well, and sometimes people actually don't want to do that. They don't want to sit with the emotion, and we end up not being able to move forward because they're like, I don't want to talk about this, it's too personal. But then I'm like, but that's the crux of the piece. Like, we can't have the piece without this because that's what you're talking about. But yeah, so sometimes we'd be literally asking the person, like, you need to sit with this emotion. What happened here and what did this lead you to? Or you need to sit with this event, or this is such a big idea. How can you kind of go deeper into it and dig deeper with this? It's a lot of those kind of questions that we would use to help support the writer, particularly in figuring out what they're trying to say and how they can better say what they're trying to say. Yeah.
That's such good advice for a writer who's setting out and starting with their first draft of pitch, because already you can kind of have the editor's voice in your head saying, what is it you're really trying to say? Are you just skimming ahead or skipping ahead instead of like going into that emotion that really deserves to be explored there, because that's really central to the piece? Like already that's going to help a lot. I really hope, inshallah, this interview will really help a lot of people who are wanting to write an article. Maybe they haven't gone there yet, or maybe they haven't had a pitch accepted yet, and these are the kinds of things that they can do to refine their writing. I know we did have one question from a member. We had two. One was answered already. Nafisa, do you want to unmute and share it?
Assalamu alaikum. This has been so this has been so great. I share with Medina that we're going to have to write a lot of resources just based on this. And alhamdulillah, thanks for affirming too why we're doing the Muslim Writers Salon, because we also feel that we need more Muslim voices, because we are so diverse and there's not a single story. Thank you for that. We have one question, and this person is currently works in consulting. And how would you transition into the publishing industry? What has been your experience doing this?
It's a hard question.
Yeah, it's a hard question, right? But maybe you could talk a little bit about, like, I know in the beginning you talked a little bit about how you were writing for Amaliah, then became an editor. So how
I'm just thinking about that actually, yeah. Because the thing is, before I became an editor for Amaliah, I've been editing like in my personal time. I really, really love editing literally people's work and people's pieces. So I've been editing before Amaliah, just for free. I would say though, like if you're trying to transition into publishing from consulting, I would say take it slow. And it could just be a matter of writing from time to time and submitting it, or sending out lots of pitches. It also depends on the capacity in which you want to transition to publishing. Is it into an editorial role or in a writing role? If it's editorial role, I would say that it's usually helpful to take on like a role as an editorial assistant. It might be something part-time, it might be something freelance, but then that allows you to start thinking about how, or getting to see how it works and how to build your experience and your portfolio. That's literally, I guess that's the advice I would give. It's just literally putting yourself out there, not being afraid to seek out opportunities, and not being afraid to kind of start slow. Like, it could be editing a friend's article, it could be asking someone to give you work to edit. But I would say start slow whilst you're still working, and then kind of work your way into the industry little by little. Because the publishing industry is a little bit brittle. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's great advice, and thank you. Is there anything else about, like, are there any resources that writers that you would give to writers about the pitching process or the writing process, or are there any good sites or books that you might recommend?
I can't think off the top of my head, but I know that there are quite a few articles online that really detail like what to include in your pitch, just because it's a really hard work to nail down a pitch and say, this is what I'm trying to say in like 200 words or 250 words. So I would say there are quite a lot of articles online possibly that kind of talk about the pitching process. In terms of writing, I would say the thing about writing is that writing, just getting better at writing, which you probably already know. I mean, you're running a Muslim writer's salon. It's just writing and writing and writing over and over again. Like, that's literally the way that one gets stronger. And I think the more you write, the more you work hard at refining what you're trying to say, the slightly easier it becomes. And for you to kind of see when you're not writing what you're trying to say, or when you're kind of going and beating about the bush, but not really nailing down on a point. Like, I think it becomes easier the more you do it. And also, I would say sharing your work with someone before submitting it, because normally you would have that one chance of like submitting the first draft, and if it doesn't really hit the mark, or if it doesn't show to the editor that you put in the work, then they might not say yes, because they might have a stronger piece. So if you've written something and you can't seem to figure out what's wrong with it, or if it's even good enough, or any of those things, you could just share it with one or two people and ask them for what they think. Sometimes it literally takes someone telling you, oh, that didn't make sense to me, or I'm not sure I get what you're trying to say. And that really helps you to realize that actually the piece isn't doing what the piece is supposed to be doing. So I would definitely recommend sharing your piece with one or two people before submitting it to an editor. Because actually I forgot to add that point, when you submit a pitch to us and we accept it, there's normally a caveat saying the pitch being accepted doesn't necessarily mean that the article is accepted. And so when the article comes back, that's kind of how we judge if it's something we want to put in the work to edit or not. So I'll definitely recommend seeking feedback from one or two people in your writing community. And if you don't have anyone in the community, it could literally just be a friend telling you if that made sense. Because we consume information every day, so we can kind of gauge when something doesn't really resonate, when something doesn't really make sense to us, and when we're not really feeling something. Yeah.
That's amazing advice. Thank you so much. And that's one of the great things about a network, like having a writing network or a community. Over time, you figure out who's kind of in the same, just has the same vibe as you in terms of your interests and what kind of things you like, whether you're writing poetry or fiction or non-fiction, and you can kind of buddy up and find somebody who'll read your stuff, and you know, then they can read yours and you can read theirs. And that's, I think, it is absolutely one of the best things. And I wanted to say something else, and I keep forgetting the points that I wanted to make. Oh, no. That's just me being forgetful. Anyway, thank you so much. We've been on for like about an hour now, so I want to be really mindful of your time. So Suad, you've given us so much to think about and so much amazing advice for up and coming writers. And I really hope that some of our writers will pitch to you, and that you'll find their pitches interesting and choose to work with them, inshallah.
So. Inshallah. It's been such a honor being here. I've really enjoyed answering these questions and speaking about writing and editing. I love talking about writing and editing, so it's been such a pleasure. Alhamdulillah.
Yeah, there are pet topics as well. Thank you so much. And inshallah, everyone who is watching this later will benefit. Please do comment and add whatever it is that you'd like to add into the comments. And thank you so much, Suad. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Assalamu alaikum.